This is the first of 4 Naval Heritage lectures that we're going to do this year during the academic year. The next one you'll have I think it's in January, on the marking the centenary of naval aviation. Then there'll be another one, and then at the end of the year on the Battle of Midway, when we celebrate that anniversary. For those of you who don't know me or don't remember me as the guy who spoke at Convocation, I'm Professor John Hattendorf, the Ernest J. King Professor of Maritime History here at the college, and Director of the Naval War College Museum. In fact, I started out here years ago. Hard to believe now that it's 45 years since the President of the Naval War College commissioned my class at OCS. How was I to know at that point that somehow I'd be connected with the institution all these years later? But I've been here off and on of the staff and the faculty since the late 1960s. So I guess that's the reason why they moved my office to the museum where I reside now. The idea of the lecture today is to talk a little bit more about this place and this town, the naval connections here, to give you a little bit of feeling of the heritage of the naval heritage here. We found in past years that students would come to the Naval War College, but they didn't really connect with the naval side of it or the naval history and aspects of that. So that's what I want to talk about. It's really more an informative lecture and to tell you a little bit about the heritage of which you are certainly a part. See if I get this right. Get the right. No. Yep. The college, of course, you could say this is a chart of the college. Doesn't come out too well on that screen. The chart was first published in 1776, the first hydrographic chart of this area. But of course, the naval history goes back even a little bit further. We can say that even with the discovery, it might have even been a naval discovery, although that was a little bit before state navies, in 1525-26, when Giovanni da Verrazzano came here. He spent about 10 days here. He didn't build a bridge, that came later. But he was in an Italian in French pay under the pay of Francis I, and he was in a king's ship. So maybe we can say that that's an early naval aspect here, certainly going to our traditions of close relations with France and with the Italian community in that period. In the early 18th century, the Royal Navy had a small station ship here, but nothing really big happened until the Revolution, about the time of this chart was built. If you come over to the museum, we now have an original of this from 1780. It recently arrived, appraised at $20,000, believe it or not, but it's in beautiful condition. And what it was, the Royal Navy was thinking of establishing a naval station here, even in that early, perhaps as early as the 1760s. In 1776, of course, the British Army and the Royal Navy came here, and Newport was a major base for the British forces. The British had, in reading about the American Revolution, you know that the British thought at first that the revolutionary impulse was all based in the coastal cities rather than in the town or in the South. They later decided that was a mistake, but they did at first. So that's one of the reasons why Newport was occupied. Newport was the 5th largest of the colonies in English North America at the time. It was a major trading port. You wouldn't know that, but the others like Boston, New York, Charleston, Philadelphia were the other major cities of that time. The Royal Navy was here until 1779. And then they withdrew, and that's when the strategy changed, and the fleet began, British forces began to concentrate on the South. Nothing happening here in 1779 as far as the occupying forces come. But in 1780, the French came. They had first come actually in 1778. The Comte d'Estaing had come and fought his way into the harbor and attempted the Battle of Long Island, or Battle of Rhode Island here. But that failed. The French fleet had to fight their way back out into the open ocean when they heard that the Royal Navy squadron was outside. They were forming up to start a battle, a major classic fleet battle out here. It was August of 1778. What happens in August around here? Possibility of a hurricane, and sure enough, there was a hurricane. Blew both fleets down to the Delaware coast. They had they repaired themselves at sea and came back, tried to fight again, but gave up. At that point, French went up into Boston and spent the year there. But in 1780, a new expedition was launched from France to support the Americans. And this was the Comte de Rochambeau, who came here, spent a year here, and then the 5,000 soldiers who were here took boats to Providence and walked to Yorktown, Virginia. The ships stayed here and then took the siege artillery down into Chesapeake Bay and played a major role in that activity. But meanwhile, there were some other things going on here in the bay. If I get this to work, no, come on. There. This guy, a sailor who likes his beer, obviously. This is Abraham Whipple, one of the great heroes of Rhode Island. About here in the 1774, he probably played one of the key roles in the Gaspee affair, which was an attack on a Royal Navy customs collector. This wonderful painting, you might have seen it before, it's in the museum. The original is now in the museum at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. I had it up here a couple years ago. It's a great, huge thing. But Whipple became the first Commodore of the Rhode Island State Navy, one of the predecessors of the National Navy, the Continental Navy that was established in October of 1775, or October 13th is the Navy's birthday. That's when the Continental Congress actually decided to establish a naval force. But there were several small forces that were established elsewhere in the prospect of that. The next sort of important group that comes along here, of course, is a family. We didn't have any naval base here after the new republic was established, but the Perry family, who creates a real early dynasty in the United States Navy. The man up there on the left is Christopher Raymond Perry, who after the reestablishment of the Navy, or the creation of what the United States Navy in the 1790s, became one of the first captains in the Navy. He was from Newport, born on the other side of the bay. He had been born of a Quaker family and came over here and brought all his children and had them, of course, as they were raised in a Quaker family, had them all baptized in the local Episcopal church down here, Trinity Church, so that they could fight first in the Revolution. He had been a privateer in the American Revolution and then went on into naval service. And this is his house, which still stands not far from here at the corner of Walnut Street and 2nd Street on the Point here. And it was in this house that his younger son was born. And I'll talk about him in a minute, but first of all, his older son, Oliver Hazard Perry, perhaps one of the more famous officers of the early republic, who was here. We have a whole class of destroyers named for this man. He was the victor of the Battle of Lake Erie on the 13th of September, 1813. He had taken a whole group of Rhode Island sailors, and they walked from here to Erie, Pennsylvania, where they built the ships that fought on Lake Erie for that battle. And of course, we're coming up now on the bicentenary of the War of 1812, so you'll be hearing a lot about this. The Rhode Island is just building a new tall ship, a new sail training ship. It's going to be called the Oliver Hazard Perry, and they have their headquarters downtown in what was Oliver Hazard Perry's own home, right in front of his statue there on Washington Square. His younger brother was equally famous, and this is Matthew Calbraith Perry. This is the statue that's in Turo Park in Newport. But he was responsible for opening Japan and negotiating the treaty for the opening of Japan. Every year we remember this with our Black Ships Festival. We have a lot of Japanese people coming here. Both the Perrys, our brothers, are buried nearby here in the Island Cemetery, and they go up and place a wreath on the grave there. We have a lot of cultural activities relating to Japan and activities here in Newport, sister city in Japan. So we have a great deal relationship along that. But this is in Turo Park. The statue was dedicated in the 1860s. And right next to it is the old stone tower. This is another tower which has a long and disputed history. It was probably built in the late 17th century by one of the colonial people, Benedict Arnold, the family of Benedict Arnold. Later, 4 or 5 generations down, the trader Benedict Arnold, who went back to the British. But the first Benedict Arnold who came here was one of the first settlers of Newport and an early governor of Rhode Island. and he bequeathed his stone-built windmill. Huge, lots of speculation about where this came from. Some people say it's really Viking. That's why we have the Viking cleaners, and the local high school team are the Vikings, and things like that. It derives from that interpretation, but there's about 50 other explanations too. Most recent lecture was just given saying that it was an 18th century folly just created out of the ruins of an old mill, and was really an 18th century structure. So there's all sorts of stuff connected with it. But I'm showing you at this place here, not in the early part, but because you'll notice that these are all in mid-19th century garb, Naval Academy midshipmen. And that's because the U.S. Naval Academy moved here in 1861 and was here through the entire length of the U.S. Civil War. They based themselves at the building is now occupying the site as the Elks Club, but that was a huge hotel called the Atlantic House. They used Fort Adams a bit. They had the training ships here. They had the training ships of the yacht America was then a U.S. training vessel, naval training vessel, as was USS Constitution. They were all here as naval training things. And interesting enough, some of the people, the key people who were here at the time, 5 of these midshipmen here later became presidents of the Naval War College. The instructor in seamanship and the man who published the first seamanship manual for the Navy was the founder of the Naval War College, Admiral Stephen, or then Lieutenant Commander Stephen B. Luce. And his #1 assistant there as an officer was a young, newly commissioned lieutenant named Alfred Thayer Mahan. And that was the first connection between Luce and Mahan. Interestingly enough, just last week, the War College Museum received a wonderful gift of Admiral Mahan's sword, which is engraved Lieutenant A.T. Mahan, 1861, and gives the date of 1861 was the date that he was promoted to lieutenant. So that was his first, and he most certainly wore that here at the Naval Academy at that time. So we'll have that out on display pretty soon. It's just being conserved. It was owned for many years by a man who had been a professor of international law here. The first permanent naval activity that comes to Narragansett Bay and to Newport is the naval torpedo station. This is Goat Island. If you know the Hyatt Hotel, this is the south end of that island. That whole island was devoted for torpedo manufacture, torpedo research from 1869 until the 1950s when it was closed. Its current descendant is the Naval Undersea Warfare Command that's still here in Newport, still doing the same sort of stuff. But in the 1860s, of course, torpedoes were the magic weapon of the day. It was the most advanced weapon, so this is where the most advanced scientific work in the Navy was being done on this little island. There's the remains of a little, at that time, there was still a little coastal colonial fort right in this area here. And these houses, I certainly remember these houses still standing in what's now that gated community in the southern part of the island. But of course, this building now, the building that you see up there, the old gate, I mean, it looked just like that until a couple years ago when they built the new gate that I just had to wait 20 minutes to come back to lunch from. But we used to come straight in like that and up the hill, up that same road. And the building on the top there, which is now occupying the museum and was the first Naval War College, was the poorhouse of Newport County. That was built in 1819 by the city of Newport to house the homeless. And this little island that we're on now, Coasters Harbor Island, was the place where it was a farm. And that's where the homeless worked, and they stayed in this building. And we over by the tennis courts there, if you've ever noticed, there's some graves up there, and there's related to that site. Of course, earlier on, as I mentioned, there was a small colonial fortress here. There was a couple of small battles out here in the bay in the 18th century. But by this period, it had been turned over to city use. Finally, the city decided to take a new approach to this kind of social problem, and this approach went away. The city gave it, actually with the help of Admiral Luce and others, the naval officers who were here, to persuade to give it to the Navy. They first gave it to the state, then the state gave it to the federal government. But if you know Rhode Island, that was a long and arduous process. We don't like to do things for the federal government in Rhode Island, never have. That's why we were the first to declare our non-allegiance to King George III and the last to sign the the Constitution. So there's this long tradition going along here. But what first came along, the first naval activity to actually use the island was the Naval Training Station, established in 1883 by Admiral Luce. Up to this point, there was no enlisted training for officers or for enlisted people anywhere in the Navy. What happened was that sailors were sent to a station ship and then sent out to their own ship for their own training and be trained on board individual vessels. There was no organized way that it was done, and that wasn't done until 1883, and the first such boot camp, as you want to call it, what goes on at Great Lakes today, or used to go on in San Diego, was done here from 1883. And the field that you crossed going down to the Officers Club, the Officers Club itself was one of the buildings for that establishment, but that was Dewey Field. That was the first recruit training station, or recruit marching field for sailors. I guess it's sort of up roundy and like that, maybe like marching on the waves. I don't know where they get it, but we do have a photo in the museum of Admiral of the Navy George Dewey on board. But Admiral Luce's idea was not to march around. What he wanted to do, he brought a 74-gun ship of the line down here, which was down at the pier in front of the Officers Club. That's the New Hampshire. There he is up there, and this was published just as the War College was established here. He came in the next year. He was by that time he was Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, the highest position in the Navy at the time. There was no CNO, there was nothing higher, only the afloat commands, and he was it. And he hauled down his flag as Commander-in-Chief of the squadron, rowed ashore with his small staff, going across Dewey Field, marched up these very same steps that are still there today, and had the famous quote where he knocked on the door 3 times and said, "In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, I christen the poor little poorhouse, the United States Naval War College." Presidents of the Naval War College have gotten a lot of mileage out of the poor little poorhouse line for years as we asked for our budget. But the local newspapers picked it up right away and said with headlines, even the Army Navy Times said, Trinity College established in Newport, having been blessed by the Trinity. This is the first faculty of the Naval War College that you can see here. Professor Soley, the first later to be Undersecretary of the Navy, was the first civilian professor here. The first man in uniform of any kind as a lecturer here was an Army officer, in this case Lieutenant Tasker Bliss, the later Chief of Staff of the Army, and the first president of the Army War College was here. And this was the aide to the president at the time. The inside of the building, what we now call Founders Hall, this is the only image we have of it. It is a National Historic Register landmark site, which is the highest level of a landmark a building can get in the United States, given by the Department of the Interior. But it's given that because it is the first Naval War College building, and it was in that building that Alfred Thayer Mahan gave his lectures that became his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And that's what it looked like. This might be supposed to be loose, I don't know. Someone talking about either a war game or tactics out there. Certainly the windows look pretty much the same as they do today. And here he is, Alfred Thayer Mahan. He was Luce's, perhaps his third choice to come up here to lecture at the Naval War College. What Luce wanted was someone who could, as he said, do for the Navy what Jomini had done for the Army. To create a body of thought and theory about what naval actions were, connect it with international relations. And he had another man in mind who was actually one later president of the War College, Caspar Goodrich, who had been first in his class at the Naval Academy, but he was off with the British observing British activities in Egypt at the time and the bombardment of Alexandria. Finally settled on Mahan, maybe realizing that his father was a very famous professor of engineering at West Point and one of the great interpreters of Jomini in the United States. But anyway, as he was coming up here, he had been commanding a vessel in the South American station on the Pacific coast, and he came up and was given the job of creating this. He was given the job of a lecturer in history and naval tactics. Then they moved forward and then went ahead and of course published his books here. And when he came to lecture, Luce had to leave and was reassigned back to the fleet again, and Mahan became the second president of the college. He returned again for a second tour as president of the college, and that's when Luce Hall was built, and under his presidency, under his second presidency. And he was probably the most famous person at the college at the time. In the late 1890s, these people in Washington wanted to close down the War College, and there were many people, particularly those promoting technical education, who opposed the kinds of education that the college represented, the broad theoretical, the kind of things, very things you're studying now, and wanted to only do theoretical or scientific or technical aspects of things. So they merged the college. They actually closed it, merged it with a torpedo station. Again, a huge fight followed within the Navy and with politicians, and with the help of senators, it was reestablished again, and then Luce Hall was built. And here's Luce Hall as you see it now, just under renovation. We'll be opening hopefully here in a couple of weeks. But you can see originally it had 3 entrances. The first part here was the actual classrooms in this area, and these skylights were the light into the game board areas here that was here, and also the lecture rooms. Here, these entrances here on this side and around the back were the quarters for officers assigned to the faculty here. This one was supposed to be reserved for the president of the college. They don't have a record that he actually occupied it. But there was a kitchen in the lower level, dining room, living rooms on these floors, which sometimes I think you can still see if you walk through there. Bedrooms up here, and of course, in those days, a 3rd floor for servants. Not happened today. Whoops. Come on. Okay, this is the 1893. We begin to think about contingency plans. The War College is the first institution in the Navy to really think about war plans. There was an idea, of course, had worked out in the German forces, German army. At this period, these ideas were beginning to filter across to the United States, and some people in the Army were beginning to think of it in the Navy too. And this was paralleling this activity. This is the oldest image we have of war gaming, which was so closely associated with with that planning activity in this period. They're actually planning activities in relation this is 1894, or what would go on in 1898 in the Spanish-American War. So the early contingency ideas there. And one of the interesting things are these 2 figures in the back here. When I first came here, it was always explained to me that these were stewards' mates who were supporting the game. But in fact, we found since then that these are Chinese naval officers observing what's going on in Newport. So you see there's nothing new. If they hack into our computers, they come and look at it in 1894. Here in 1894, the class of 1894 that was doing those exercises is the first class to have foreign officers. And this is the predecessor of the Naval Command College. These 2 guys, this one here and this one, are our first 2 foreign officers from Sweden. This is one of Af Uglas and Flak are the 2 that came. The following year, we had an officer from Denmark. And then the 3rd year, the Imperial German Navy asked to send somebody, and the State Department said, no way. So that ended our foreign students for a bit, and certainly not, they didn't come in any regularity until 1957 with the establishment of the Naval Command College. Here, an early famous speaker at the college, Theodore Roosevelt, on his second visit to the Naval War College, standing on this in the usual traditional photo op place on the steps of Luce Hall, still used today by folks, but he was Undersecretary of the Navy at the time in 1897. And it's here that he gave a famous talk. He actually talked about blood, sweat, and tears, a speech, words that were later more famous from Winston Churchill. but he actually used them in an address, a preparedness address here at that time. He'd come as early as 1886, just having finished his degree at Harvard, his graduate degree at Harvard, where he'd done a thesis on the War of 1812. And Admiral Luce had come to the attention of Admiral Luce, who had known his father and had a connection with him that way, and asked him to come up here and to lecture on the War of 1812. And his book was for many years a textbook at the War College on the War of 1812. The third famous figure here connected in the early days of the college is this man. His picture is not well known, but this is Charles Stockton, the famous officer who really got international law going in the Navy. There was no one in the Navy in this period who was working in international law. And he took it, the idea came up, of course, the Army had worked up the law of armed conflict right after the Civil War, and it worked up a code of that. There was nothing like that for naval warfare until 1898, when Stockton, as a commander here at the War College, was asked to develop that. And he was the first one to develop a law of armed naval warfare, and which is still referred to today. It actually became the law of the United States until the United States decided, well, we have to negotiate this with other countries, so we can't have it as our law, but we backed off from that basis. But it was used in the London Naval Treaties in 1907, and later on. And our current visiting chair for distinguished faculty members in international law is the Stockton Chair, named for him. He later went on to become the president of the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and there's a building down there named for him, too. The college, as you can see, hasn't changed too much. President's House still there. 1894, the Admiral's House was built, originally for the training station, which at that point was the senior command. But the War College has owned it and occupied it since in 1908 in this period. And you can see the training vessels that were here. This is the Constellation, the vessel that is now in Baltimore Harbor, but she was here as the station ship from 1894 until 1946. Later on in the Second World War, of course, she was used as the backup communications vessel for the Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet. Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet often flew his flag in here as a flagship. And I guess we thought that the Germans would never have thought that we'd use a wooden warship for a backup communications vessel. All these other vessels were used for recruit training in the area. Mahan Hall. This is the rotunda room. You may have been in there for some ceremonies or some activities with receptions that are here, but originally it was the original War College Library, built in 1904. The capitals of the columns up here were specially built, specially cast from captured Spanish cannon in the Spanish-American War, as were the two light fixtures at the bottom of the cases there. Today we have a wonderful display of naval autographs of former Secretary of the Navy, Ambassador J. William Middendorf, and I hope you have a chance to go over and look at that. There's some wonderful pieces over there. Perhaps the star, I think, in my view, is the original letter from Thomas Jefferson to John Paul Jones, reminding him as he goes off to Russia and elsewhere that he's still an officer in the American Navy. Some of these chairs are still about here. One of the interesting things about this rotunda, I learned as a young lieutenant when I was working in the Admiral's office in the early 1970s. When I came here, this was the reference room for the library. The card catalog was between these two pillars, and the reference desk was over here on the other side. And a bunch of us junior JOs would be sitting on the other side of the catalog, sort of gossiping about what we were doing for the Admiral and this sort of thing. But we didn't know that it was being immediately transmitted to reference on the other side. And this somehow the Admiral got wind of this, and we heard about it. He quickly figured out what had happened. And we learned a little bit about acoustics. It's an early example of wargaming in Luce Hall. Probably maybe in 1910 or so. You see the small ship models. You can see some of these in a display, these little protractors that are here, activities that are here on that aspect. See those things in the museum. Another important character here as a student in 1910-11, Major Ellis, one of the great thinkers about amphibious warfare here, a Marine Corps officer, really got the whole idea of the island hopping campaign, can really be traced back to some of his ideas here when he was here on the long course. We had a long course of 2 years that was going on in that period, and he was one of the people involved with it. Here's another photo op in the standard place with Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels here, President of the War College here, and this officer here is William S. Sims, another finishing his 2-year course at the time, wearing a black armband for the death of a family member here. And let's see, I thought somewhere in the back there was a William McCarty a little bit, I don't see him. There used to be a bandstand out here in front of the Admiral's house, the Navy band playing out there. Here's a picture. Notice the recruits marching across Dewey Field here, the spectators up here. The battle fleet anchored back here. It was very common in that period before the piers were built for every year for the Atlantic Fleet to come up here and to exercise. Here, this view is taken probably from the fighting top of Constellation, looking out here, but that's not her bowsprit. She didn't go around the corner. That's the training ship called Boxer that was here at the time. And this is 1916. This is when I say that the war first came to the War College directly. This is the German submarine U-53. She suddenly, Captain Lieutenant Hans Rose is the commandant of this vessel. She appeared at the off Newport Light and request permission to enter port, much to everyone's surprise. She came in, commanding officer came ashore, had a cup of tea with the president of the Naval War College. A lot of photo ops, a lot of stuff going on, very obvious handing of dispatches to Washington. This was right after the Zimmerman telegram thing, so all sorts of buzz was going all around of what was going on here. And then she left port and went out into international waters off Nantucket Light and sank 5 vessels. They were not American, but they were all Allied vessels in the war. The United States was not yet in the war, but that certainly woke up the Naval War College and a few other people about what was going on. Of course, later there were a fair number of German submarines that came across in that area. And that's the cruiser Birmingham right behind her in Narragansett Bay. William S. Sims was the president of the War College as a captain in 1917. He had been, as I mentioned before, showed him in that picture, he had been a student here and the 2-year course. He'd gone out later to command a destroyer division. He was one of the pioneers in creating an afloat staff and using wargaming for staff work. He came back in 1917 to be the president of the college, was almost immediately sent secretly to London to begin to think about how the United States Navy might cooperate with the British. This was even before there was a declaration of war from the United States. And then he rose in a period of a couple of years between 1917 and 1919. He went all the way up to 4-star admiral as the senior U.S. commander in World War I in the combat theater as Commander-in-Chief U.S. Naval Forces Europe. And then he returned to Newport and took up the presidency of the Naval War College as a 2-star. And in that role, he won the Pulitzer Prize for History for writing his book on the Victory at Sea, which was the story of his activities and the story of the Navy in World War I. And he became a great critic of Washington and used his presidency to start congressional investigations of the way the Navy operated and the way what he called the inefficiency of the Navy Department in this period. So that was a lively place in those days under Sim presidency. This is the last class of which he was president. This picture was taken in October of 1922, and he was to leave in the following spring. But it's an interesting picture because it shows the really, it's an icon, I think, for showing the change of generations. Here's Sims as the president sitting in the middle of the bottom row here, and directly here, right above him, is Commander Chester W. Nimitz. in the senior class of 1923. Over here, this is Captain Harold Stark, his predecessor. He was Chief of Naval Operations in 1941. Down here is a later president of the War College, Harris Lanning. And then, don't see him right now, but the couple of the fleet commanders are also in this picture. So it shows how the experience of the First World War perhaps was transmitted to the naval officers in the Second World War. And of course, it was in what Nimitz later recalled in a lecture to the students here in the 1960s, is that there was nothing in the war that had surprised him, because it had been, they had talked so much about in classes here what the War College would do or what the Japanese might do, and they war gamed it all. And the only thing that really surprised him was the kamikazes. But none of the major fleet movements or tactics or aspects of what Japan did during the war, he felt, had been a surprise because he'd learned the basics of that here at the Naval War College. As had almost all of the flag officers at the initial part of the war. Every flag officer but one on the 7th of December 1941 had been a Naval War College graduate at that point. In the 1920s, of course, we had a number of visitors here. This guy is a Japanese admiral coming to visit, head of naval military education. And this Japanese officer with his top hat is a man named, become famous as Yamamoto. He was not a graduate of the U.S. Naval War College, as whoever looks at our Wikipedia entry and keeps putting it on there. He was at Harvard during the First World War when the War College was closed during the actual period of our combat period when he was there. So he couldn't have attended, but he did come for a visit. And this is the picture of his visit out by the flagpole in front of the museum, where those same cannon or those Civil War Dahlgren guns are still there. So if anyone tells you he graduated from the War College, you say, no, not true. This is a picture of President of the War College, William Vesey Pratt, entering Luce Hall, Undersecretary of the Navy, coming with him at the time. Pratt was has been so up to date at least, the only president of the Naval War College to become the Chief of Naval Operations. He had the tough job of becoming CNO in the Hoover administration. Hoover, of course, was a Quaker and didn't have much time for anybody in armed forces. And so, but Pratt was trying to build the Navy in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and ran into all that, as well as the restraints of the disarmament treaties. In Pringle Hall, which is now the Naval Staff College lounge area, was the first purpose-built wargaming facility in the United States Navy, built in 1934. What's now the lounge area was originally this board, this checkerboard here. You can see the ship models out here. The balcony, which you can still see most of it. Part of it, of course, has been cut off and made into a classroom on one end of it, but you can still see what's going on there. People could observe up there. These wires here, you can see the curtain here that was used to obscure what the opposing fleet might have been doing, indicate the fog of war, if you will, in the days before radar. But that's the way the war games were played up until the 1950s or late 1940s, when we acquired Sims Hall and began to play down there. You can still see one of the original game board is still shown down there. What was the logistics war gaming board? But students have always had the same view of the War College. Here in 1937, you see Commander B.S. arrives, prepared for a serenely meditative year and some light reading, but through renewing old associations and playing golf. But it's that faculty again, telling them to keep reading those books. So your views have been echoed over the years. When you came to work today, you probably came down Admiral Kalfas Road. This is Admiral Kalfas. He was later a four-star officer here. He is twice president of the War College. In those days, as so often, he would go out into the fleet. He was president of the War College as a two-star, went out of the fleet, became a three-star, came back again as a two-star, went out again as a four-star, came back as a four-star, but then dropped down again. And finally, they finally changed the law that that the job went with the person, or the title went with the person, not with the job. But that didn't really happen until 1944 when we created the 5-star rank of Admiral, Fleet Admiral. But he had such a wonderful relationship with the town that the city, and the close relationship between the Navy and the city of Newport, that they named the street for him. This is some of the defenses of Narragansett Bay. He later, in the war, he was here as the Naval Operating Base Commander as well as President of the War College. He was in charge of the whole defense of this region, where there are all sorts of activities going on here. You can see this in detail over in the museum, what's going on here, but there was an ammunition station here, training station here, torpedo air Quonset Point here, the Naval Air Station here, the CB base, all kinds of activities. And out on these here, there was 16-inch gun, coastal batteries here, and way out down here at Point Judith as well. Gates across the entrance to Narragansett Bay, anti-submarine gates here. And of course, we did it the very last day, almost the day before the war ended, we had a submarine, a German submarine that attempted to enter. This is one of the anti-aircraft batteries that was out on Ocean Drive in 1945. There were lots of these anti-aircraft batteries around. There was one right here where the parking lot in McCarty Little was. There were a couple here on the island and a couple around the area. This is what I call an alumni meeting out in the Pacific. Fleet Admiral King here, the Chief of Naval Operations, Naval War College class of 1934. Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific, Naval War College class of 23. Raymond Spruance, class of 1927, out here meeting on board Spruance's flagship, the Indianapolis. But some of our perhaps our most famous World War II graduates. After the war, we acquired Sims Hall, which had been one of the barracks here at the Naval Training Station, and then was made into War College use again. More recently, it went away and is just coming back to us again now for War College use. The man who was in charge of the college at this period was Admiral Spruance. Here he is here as president of the college from 1946 to 1948. This was his 4th tour of duty at the Naval War College. He'd been a student, he'd been head of our correspondence course, and then he'd been head of our tactics and strategy department before the war, and then came back after the war. It was a great influence here. Many of his innovations still operate today. My job, for example, the chair, the Ernest J. King Chair of Maritime History, was Spruance's idea. And he asked Admiral King, Fleet Admiral King, to have it named for him, and it was later filled after he left, but it was, that job continues. Another aspect of what he started was the Naval War College Review, then called U.S. Information Services for Officers. This is volume 2 from it, but the idea was to publish college lectures and get them a wider out, and more later in the 1960s, it became a more academic journal and with a wider reputation. But certainly I remember it, I had as a lieutenant, I published my first article in the War College Review. At that time, the readership to the review was limited to lieutenant commanders. So I got in really bad trouble with my executive officer, who thought this was really uppity of the ops officer to be publishing in the War College Review as only a lieutenant. But then he came to the War College, and I had him as a student. Another famous person here, he didn't do very well. Another famous person connected with Newport, whose work you see all around you around the college, is Felix de Welden, the famous Austrian sculptor who came here, settled in Newport, had his studio here in Newport. Here he is doing a bust of Admiral Conley Hall, the next building over, when he was president of the college from the 1950s. De Welden, of course, is most famous for his statue in Arlington National Cemetery, of the Marine Corps Memorial, raising the flag of Iwo Jima. He had a long discussion about that, and I think that photo was actually brought to his attention by Admiral Spruance, and the statue that you see out here, one of the maquettes of that statue we have in our outside this auditorium, was one of the early maquettes for it. Another famous man we have a building named for, or a library is named for, is Henry Eccles here, a Naval Academy class of 1922. A wonderful man. I knew him in his older age. He was the great guru, the great intellectual around here in those days. Wrote a great deal about military philosophy. We have a huge collection of his papers here. And he was one of the real pioneers in the area of naval logistics. He had wrote the Navy's first manuals in this area, headed our Naval Logistics Department for many years, and had really been involved in the organization of logistics in the island hopping campaign in the Pacific. Wargaming in those days had this huge, wonderful screen, sort of Dr. Strangelove look to it, in Spruance Hall. It was really dramatic to go in there and see the moves here. You can see the Indian Ocean here. I mean, this is probably a picture in the 50s or 60s of going on in those days. It doesn't quite have that panache that it does today. Here are one of our summer visitors, the quarters A, here next to the President's house. Admiral Weisskopf just vacated and moved back to the proper War College headquarters, but that building was the summer White House in 1957. And here he is being introduced to the NCC class at that period, and NCC director of that day, and the president there. He came back for 3 of the 4 summers of his second term here in Newport. His real interest as a general of the Army, of course, was not in what the Navy was doing, but to play golf during his summer vacation. But his staff continued to occupy the building that is now the museum. His office was actually an extension to that building. It's now no longer standing. But that he did his official acts there. We have his presidential flag over on display in the museum. And certainly during his first period, he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957. There, he sent troops into Little Rock, Arkansas. While he was here, Governor Faubus from Arkansas came up, and you can see a helicopter landing on the sidewalk between here and the Oak Club in that period. So lots of activities were there. He also entertained the King of Belgium using the War College President's barge in that period. Here you see we used to have the fleet cruiser destroyer force. Atlantic Fleet was based here in Newport. That's the heavy cruiser Newport News, steaming out past the War College. There's the old fleet signal tower on that side of the college here, the old communication station that was based there. Here, President Kennedy came to lecture. He spoke in Spruance Hall, and he came here. Actually, this is President Austin of the War College, Vice Admiral Austin. Here's one of the Dulles brothers, and this is the new head of the CIA, John McCone. He came to announce that change in CIA's leadership. Sometimes Kennedy would have his White House here in Newport. Sometimes it was at Hyannisport, but sometimes it was here at Mrs. Kennedy's home at Hammersmith Farm. Another famous figure here in the early days is Admiral Bates, who Spruance had brought him here to do the studies of fleet battles right after the Second World War, what could be learned from those battles. Here, he was a crusty old salt, as I remember him, and he was the guy who designed the original War College tie. Bit of sartorial triviality. Come on. Admiral Richard Colbert came as a captain. Of course, he was the first director of Naval Command College in 1957. Later became famous as the Mr. International Navy, the great exponent of international naval cooperation, that thing that's so basic to our naval strategy of the 21st century about cooperation with other navies. He was the pioneer who really developed that. He came back as a vice admiral, president of the War College. He laid the groundwork to establish the Naval Staff College here, our intermediate level foreign officers course. He was the key figure in establishing the Standing Naval Force Atlantic and NATO Standing Naval Force Atlantic. And he later in 1971, as a 4-star, went on to be Commander-in-Chief, Allied Forces, Southern Europe, and he died in that position from cancer while he was there. This is the first class of the Naval Staff College. Here, that's Jack Quinn, who our classroom is named for, the first director. This was the deputy president of the time. And of course, in the 1970s, people such as Colbert and Admiral Hayward, his predecessor, arranged for all these new buildings to be built. This is the model of it. It was originally to have a great Carillon Tower here, which never appeared, but otherwise looks pretty much the same. And the great heroic statues of naval officers on what later became Colbert Plaza was never built either, though we have some of the maquettes for that in our museum collection. Here in 1973 is really the beginning of the Naval War College curriculum as you are learning about it right now. Then Vice Admiral Stansfield Turner announcing the new curriculum, Secretary of the Navy, Ambassador J. William Middendorf there speaking to the platform. Ambassador Middendorf still lives here in Rhode Island, in his mid-80s now, but lives over in Little Compton. But it was to this occasion that he gave his famous, Turner gave his famous convocation address out on the lawn in front of Luce Hall. I was a young lieutenant up here. I was the admiral's speechwriter, and I was up here because just at this point when the secretary started to speak, a helicopter came over and we couldn't get control of it to get it out of town so we could hear the speaker. Turner came here and brought one of his friends, one of his classmates up here, and this guy who was governor of Georgia, and we kept all the JOs around said, who is this guy? Okay, he's a admiral's classmate, but what is this? Well, admirals were smarter than lieutenants. 2 weeks later, he announced his candidacy for president of the United States, and Turner became chief of the Central Intelligence Agency under him. In the fleet base here in Newport, we had some 45 ships based here at the piers. You can see where the carriers are today with this kind of Fram kind of destroyer here, and some of these early other ones here, the tender, that's the Samuel Gompers that was here at that time. In 1973, the Navy left Newport. The legend that still lives is that the reason for that was that the Rhode Island and Massachusetts were the only two states that voted against Nixon in the election. That's not true. I just recently published an article explaining what this was. This was really a Navy's decision. The politicians, particularly the Democrats, decided that that was a good line to use to support their party. So as Senator Claiborne Pell told me himself, that's why he promoted that usage of the idea, which has been very successful because almost everybody believes it. But the Navy decided that they had to move because the naval operating areas, Narragansett Bay area, was directly under the air corridors to New York City and needed to go south to the Capes or even further south to do missile firings in that period. And if the ships were leaving here, then the Boston Naval Shipyard had to close. Another reason for keeping that reason secret, the Secretary of Defense that time was Elliot Richardson, who had been a former governor of Massachusetts, and he had run on the campaign to save the Boston Naval Shipyard. So he wasn't very anxious to have it come out that he had to condone that decision. But after that, everyone at the time in the 70s predicted Newport would die. There was nothing happened here. And actually, it was the basis for a great new rebirth of Newport as a tourist area, and the tourist area that you see right now. Here on this very platform is Vice Admiral James Stockdale, then the president of the War College, Medal of Honor winner for his period in 8 years in captivity in Vietnam, and Henry Kissinger as a speaker here. The only time that I know of, certainly that I ever experienced, where it was a black tie event for everyone. And we were required to wear a black tie in the audience as well as up here, and in honor of Kissinger, who gave an excellent lecture in that period. But as he came up here and he said, I really want to do honor to Mrs. Stockdale, and she's the one who kept bugging me about the prisoners of war in this period, so all honor to her most appropriately. Here in 1981, we established the Center for Naval Warfare Studies at that time, and also the CNO's Strategic Studies Group. This is Admiral Thomas Hayward, then CNO, and this is the college president, Eddie Welch, who was the president then. And this is SSG-1, which had a number of people here, a later president of the War College, Arthur Sobrowski. Here, Others, Admiral Owens, other well-known figures in the Navy who were in the first group of that, which still, of course, continues under Admiral James Hogg. And our graduations and ceremonies used to be out on the plaza here, but it's been not much space anymore, so we do them under the tents, and that was the size of the faculty in those days, much smaller group. Admiral Sobrowski as president of the War College. Here, of course, the man who invented the idea of network-centric warfare, something we're still talking about. Admiral Rout, one of the others who went ahead. He was a 2-star here. He became a 3-star as superintendent of the Naval Academy. And well, before that goes away, this picture here shows he was the head of missile defense, was one of his great areas. This is the USS Lake Erie, here named after the Battle of Lake Erie, firing a missile. The commanding officer of that vessel at the time of the firing was later Vice Admiral Ronald Rout, president of the War College. And then our most recent building, McCarty Little from 1990, our home of the Center for Naval Warfare Studies and our wargaming facility there. Newly built building, of course, the college has expanded with taking over some other buildings along the way. And there you have the full campus as we know it today. Sims Hall down here, surface warfare down here, things still changing and evolving as always. And then, of course, last year we celebrated our 125th anniversary since our establishment in 1884. Well, that ends my quick remarks, but if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them, or if you hope you will take some time to come over to the Naval War College Museum and see our exhibits there, which expand on all of the things that I've talked about here, or to see the exhibit that's up in Mahan Hall. Thank you very much. Question?
Who was the first African-American to attend the Naval War College?
The first American? African. Don't know, but I think it was in 1957, in the early class of 1957. I'll have to go look and see. Other question? No? Thank you very much.